technical problem, I'm able to know about it. So, again, another resilience lecture, historic houses and their custodians, traveling all over India, meeting owners of historic houses, and sometimes, people who work at historic houses, who manage historic houses as well. So I'll go to the next slide. So you've seen from the first slide the orientation that I was giving. I'll just talk a little bit about the Center for Historic Houses. We have a lot of material to cover, so I'll be brief. So as a Center for Historic Houses, we'll deal with three stakeholders. One is the group of owners of historic houses. We advise them, we collaborate, we learn from them as well, to see what their needs are, and to really be at the pulse, to really know what is happening at the moment and to respond immediately. We also are in touch with the heritage experts and the related industries, which could be, artisans, people, heritage managers, museum professionals working with historic houses, both in India and abroad. And we work with the public. We organize events for the public, and we interact with the government as well. Currently, we are working with, the students have been working on creating exciting events for Rashtrapati Bhavan, especially for children. And we'll be continuing this from October, when the session is starting, working with other universities, especially in the UK. So we have them. I just talk about the four main areas. I've kind of covered the other part earlier. So we are, of course, as an academic institution, interested in research and documentation, but we go far beyond this, because what we really do is we plan business plans for historic houses, visitors, and especially now during the COVID-19 phase, we are developing non-visitor related business plans. To help and ensure revenue for these historic houses, which have been really seriously hit during the pandemic. We also want to improve visitor experience when it is possible. So we work very strongly on heritage interpretation, lifelong learning. We also work with the architecture school. I'm myself a practicing interior designer specializing in historic houses and palaces, with interior design, whether it's restaurants, guest rooms, hotels, etc., with the historic houses, and we plan events. And of course, we forge partnerships both with houses and owners and with other academic institutions. So one fantastic event that we initiated is the Palace Day, which was initiated by the Château de Versailles and the European Network of Royal Residences, but we introduced it to India just on the 19th of July, so this Sunday, and it was really an incredible event. We are very grateful for the support of the World Monuments Fund and UNESCO, Taj Hotels and Imrana Hotels. And it was really the first time to bring owners of palaces together as a kind of union. And it was a wonderful moment to celebrate, and something we really needed in these times of the pandemic. And I'll show you this. So we are really pleased to have put the Indian palaces on the map. And you see these are the European palaces. And this is, the first time that Indian palaces participated. And you see all of India is covered, which makes me really proud. So we had over 40 palaces who were in touch with us, and more will be joining next year. And this is just, a little idea about the social media input and the impact that we had. So altogether, we reached about 85,000, which is really very nice for the first time, and just a small group of people. It was wonderful, and thanks to all who participated. And we want to continue, and I really hope that this will have a lasting impact. And, also what you see from the map is this kind of India, Asia, and Europe. And we also, this is the soft power of cultural politics. And, it's really wonderful to see this, happy encounter between East and West and these historic ensembles of palaces. This is another very exciting project we are doing. We are rejuvenating traditional water bodies in Haryana and villages. And here you see images of what it looks like. So it's really kind of flat. But it can look really, really green. And we have, of course, the monsoon at the moment. And, there is a lot of dust. I always think of Heat and Dust, the book by Ruth Praver Javala, before I came to India. And this is really, what I found. And So I feel whenever we help and do things for the community and together with the community and also learning from the community, it's not only a kind of, condescending attitude, but it's really learning from them as well and listening to their needs and listening and learning from their incredible resilience. I feel we have to do the best. And so I was really inspired by this beautiful water garden. And, water and heritage is a focus of the center as well. And it's a very important focus. This is the Meridian Hotel in Jaipur. And the landscape architect who created this, he was inspired by the traditional kind of charbark design and also this traditional Indian game now known as Pachisi. And so I've contacted him and his partner, and we will be working together to redevelop the traditional water bodies in a local village near the university. And he was also collaborating with a very well-known academic, landscape designer in the United States who created this wonderful adventure playground in Central Park in New York. And this is our wish, to bring this to the village in Haryana and to make it a wonderful project for all of India to see and abroad. So anybody who wants to help contribute with this project, we'd love to have your support, because I think it can make a huge difference for the community.
Hello, Mimi. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. Just wanted to say hello to everyone and let you know I'm here.
Great, Akshita. Thank you very much for joining. It's lovely to have you. We are so excited about this. So just very briefly, if we talk about palaces, this is, one of the most wonderful palaces in India. I find it's the Lake Palace in Udaipur, currently run as a Taj Hotel. How can we talk about social issues? And this is a beautiful photograph by Steve McCurry. And of course, it looks so romantic and colorful, but we mustn't forget about the hardship that people experience as well. But I wanted to choose this picture of the Lake Palace to demonstrate that although this is this beautiful and dreamlike pleasure palace in 18th century and continuously built in the 19th century, which is associated with luxury, this is an artificial lake. So lake palaces were usually created in the desert states of Rajasthan. But the lake also benefited the local community. And I think this is something very unique to Indian palaces, that you have all the beauty, the magnificence of the palace, but you also have the down-to-earth utilitarian aspect of the palace, such as this one, and delivering water to the local community and to the owners as well. And I wanted to accentuate that these family-owned historic houses of India do contribute to society. They have done so in the past, and they're still continuing to do so. And I've just, I'm highlighting some of these historic houses that we've had in the past, whether it's, a young heritage scholar and art historian who started a heritage organization in her community in Bhavnagar, to someone who is preserving the living heritage of Mavari horses and having actually, the only Asian school for horseshoes, and this is fantastic. Or someone who is just not afraid to see a ruin like this and transform it into something like this. These are people who do not give up. These are all entrepreneurs, and this brings us to today's topic. Although we have, a different palace or different historic house every week, I always try to have a kind of introduction with a specific topic. And today I'd like to discuss the topic of social entrepreneurship. So where does this term come from? Well, it was really created, I'd say, by Bill Drayton, who is a visionary who created this term in the 1980s. And I think the term has changed considerably ever since. I first heard about it when I was a student in the 1990s, and already then I had the vision of connecting palaces with this principle of social entrepreneurship. And the idea in a nutshell is basically that you create something for the social good. There is a sense of, the heart and empathy involved in something that you do. And I think today's guest is very much about this. And I think somewhere on social media, I wrote kind of, mind, heart, and also taste. So this is the kind of paradigm shift that I would like to introduce and that I would like to propagate when it comes to historic houses in India, to combine design, to combine heritage and historic houses with entrepreneurship. So one of the changes that we have seen is that while Bill Drayton looked at entrepreneurs primarily working for NGOs, I think it has shifted to a more hybrid model from the kind of not-for-profit models and finding solutions to some of the world's biggest problems, seeing them and going after the solving them. And whenever you find a problem, you kind of rattle things up. And how do you do this? And how do the successful people do this? And when the whole world will tell you that you can't do it, that it cannot be done, it's not possible, there are people who don't give up. And these are the people that are resilient. And this is all kind of ties in with the whole kind of lecture series of resilience. So other models have kind of moved from the kind of not-for-profit sector to combining profit with a social impact. And we'll hear more about a concrete case study today. And before I lead over now to Akshita, I'd like to have my usual kind of quote about resilience. Although suffering and challenge demoralize some human beings, others cope and construct instead. Rather than grinding to a halt, certain people hurdle the obstacles. They even make something positive out of the negative situation. In face of crisis, they not only survive, but they also thrive. So thank you very much for the poll results today, because we want to have a very interactive session. So we wanted to understand who is our audience, and we know you already come from all parts of India, you come from all corners of the world. But here we just have a look. So the biggest kind of group is heritage lovers, heritage enthusiasts, followed by academics, followed by academics and heritage experts as well. This is really interesting to see. Thank you very much. Okay, so from this, I'd like to lead it over to Akshita, and I stop my my presentation. And Akshita, I'd like to hand it over to you. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us. And I just should say before you start, with Palace Day, we looked at 40 fantastic palaces, but this was the one property that caught my attention because it was so innovative and really fits all the bills. And I think it's wonderful that we have such a young person and a woman having such a great vision, and having already demonstrated what she can do by restoring and the building, bringing it back to life, and pursuing all of these various initiatives. Thank you very much for being with us, Akshita. Please, I'm handing it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mimi and Professor. I'm quite humbled, and I should say that this is it takes a they say it takes a village to raise a child, and I think it takes a whole country to preserve a monument and a palace. So if there has been any success in the work we do in our vision, it's because of our local community. And thank you so much for that humble, I'm very humbled by that introduction. But I would like to start off by saying and introducing myself. So thank you everyone for being with us here tonight. I hope I'm audible. Please do sort of comment or let the moderators know if at any point you can't see or can't hear me clearly. I would like to start saying by, my name is Akshita M. Bhanj Deo. I'm from Mayurbhanj, Arisa, and I have been associated with the Belgadia Palace. I'm a director at the property, and I'm the director of experiences and partnerships. So something I call myself is a storyteller and tour guide, because I'm absolutely in awe of the place I call home, and the resilience is really coming from the community around us. And I hope through this lecture series, I'm able to show you a little bit of where I'm from. So without further ado, I'm going to start sharing screen. Please don't be mind boggled by the number of tabs I have open. Just give me a moment. Wow, wonderful. Great. Great. Mimi, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Let's begin then. Perfect. So I'm kind of a visual learner, so I have a lot more pictures and less text, But at any point, I requested the team to sort of steer me in which way, if you ever want me to pause. I know there's a global audience here, so I hope that I'm coherent in everything I'm saying, and y'all can sort of, I can answer a lot of the points that came up with your questions. So the topic, I wanted to begin with why I chose the name for this topic, which is reimagined spaces to foster sustainable communities. When you think of historic spaces, a lot of people go back to mythology, fairy tales, folk tales. A lot of people have an idea of what palaces are and what historic buildings are supposed to be like. When I was growing up, and I was sort of in some way informed that my ancestors were royalty, and I looked at Disney princesses, I didn't understand any of it. None of my life was like Cinderella or Snow White. The closest might be Mulan, but I might just be biased. So at the same time, for me, it was the process of restoring and reviving Mayurbhanj and Belgadia Palace has a way of coming back to my own roots. To begin with, I wanted to just focus on what I'm going to be talking about. It's going to be history and heritage, a little bit about my family, my ancestors, and sort of what role have we played in shaping the fabric of India in the past 1,000 years. Then restoration and revival, we're really going to be seeing the creation of how Belgadia Palace is where it is at today. And then experiences and social impact. I hope through this lecture, I can touch upon a little bit of why social impact was important and how we really looked at it as Belgaria as a boutique property, but more as a platform than a property. A way that we can use tourism to catalyze social development. And towards the end, I'm hoping that I can have this be as engaging and interactive so I can, we have more time for Q&A. So to begin with, before I get straight into my ancestors' history, which is quite vast and varied, I grew up between Bengal and Orissa. I studied at La Martiniere in Calcutta, and then I went for my high school to Singapore and subsequently to New York. This is important because I studied politics and human rights, and my interest was conflict studies. So when I came back, when I looked at my family history, I never needed real life examples to remember history. I just had to remember which ancestor was where. So to begin with, Mayurbhanj, the district in Orissa where the Belgadia Palace is, has been in this region. Like I say, my ancestors came here and set up shop 1,000 years ago. It was one of the largest states of the Eastern States Agency, which was something that was demarcated in colonial times, and one of the largest of the Bengal States Agency. So the size of Mayurbhanj, to give you an idea, is roughly the size of Kuwait or Nevada, if I have some American audiences here. And a point I wanted to pick on was emblems. So most royal families have emblems. But there was an interesting tale of how we got our emblem. It was 2 peacocks because of local mythology and folklore. My ancestors were born out of the eyes of a peahen and raised by the sage Vashisht, which is now our Gotra, which is a way that you sort of classify in Indian society. I think it's just something interesting only for the fact that a lot of people assume that royal families were born out of the colonial system, but royal families predated the British, predated the Mughal Empire. They predated, sometimes even going all the way back to the Somavansha, Ganga dynasties. And so they go up to, really when, about the 600 AD. This is really interesting because you realize that so much of the Indian history was told through oral storytelling. So it was passed down by local tribes and communities who came through that region. Folklore is folklore, but it's always interesting how people remember you and how your origin story is. Something interesting is that the Bhanja dynasty the word was Bhanjas, which means breakers in local terms. So that either means that they were breakers of a ruling clan who had been there previously, because Bhanja comes from Bhongo, to break. I like that because for any fans of Game of Thrones, it's interesting because there's a quote which says, most families that rule are, welded in the flame of fire. So that's either you come by violence or you come by the violence, having had been there because of protection of people and protection of tribal communities and clans. What is interesting about royal families in India is not the fact that they've been in power. We should look at monarchy as not black or white, but gray. So let's look at this as any other time in history when empires have risen and fallen. The interesting thing about a family having been in a reign for 1,000 years is resilience. Because that means that families that adapted, that were resilient, were chameleon-like, could adapt to the changing circumstances of empires coming in and going. That's really the beauty. What did this family do that made it stay for 1,000 years? And to begin with, there's a little anecdote in my family. So Akbar, which is one of the great kings of the Mughal dynasty, in his biography, the Akbarnama, one of my family's forts is mentioned because Firoz Shah Tughlaq had actually taken refuge there, and Akbar's army was not being able to penetrate into the Bhanja dynasty. So what's really important, and why historic community and historic properties need to propagate their own narrative and agency, is because so much of that was taken away by the British. And so we need to remind the local people that we are not just our circumstances and our development indicators, but we are descendants of warriors and explorers. We have survived invasions and famine and war. So there's a little bit more of my family history here, just in terms of the capitals. And so I'm going to take you through a little bit of our story through the architecture of the family. And right before I do that, I do want to punctuate this with the idea behind this. Why is it important that I come and share my story in a public platform? Why is it important that a very offbeat, remote place that most of you have never heard of before is some place that I would like people to know of? It's because my family my family recognized the need to spur development in this region. It had been lost in the annals of history. It had an extremely glorious past and rich cultural fabric. But we realized that it wasn't really on any map anymore. It was quite offbeat. And so what we wanted to do was really look at the Belgadia Palace as a way that tourism can be the way that it attracts global ideas, global investment, global entrepreneurship once more. Most of you all must have heard of the Tata Industries. So a little known fact, my great-grandfather's father, Maharaja Sri Ramchandra Bhanj Deo, was someone who actually invited J.N. Tata to Mayurbhanj to start the first Tata steel iron ore and mine. And like I say, the rest is history. So sometimes you should invest in an interesting startup idea because you have no idea where it lands up in the next 100 years. But that is to show that powerful entrepreneurship and initiatives didn't always come from cities. They actually came from much lesser remote areas. So when we think of Bihar today, we do think of its development indicators and maybe its political climate. What we should remember is Nalanda, which was called the Harvard of the East, much before Harvard was there, is from Bihar. So the cradle of civilization, as it was called, which got so many scholars from around the world to come visit Bihar. In the same lens, let's reimagine offbeat remote areas.
And actually, it's complete, with the internet and internet startups, many of the big, startups and, Skype and so on never came from cities actually, but from smaller, yeah.
Yeah. I think because entrepreneurship is inherent in places where there's an Indian word for it called jugaad, which means hustle, to really bootstrap ideas when you have a little bit of lack of resources. So that is why, again, the word resilience doesn't come from the royalty or monarchy. It really comes from something running in the blood of the people to survive, no matter which invasion and which dynasty or which foreign army sort of prevailed there. And sorry, I'm just going to focus on one point here because I know someone had mentioned social impact and how are we really sort of doing this. It was the idea to run Belgadia really came from the fact that we can employ and scale local communities. We can use Belgadia as kind of a bubble, as a startup, a community bubble where mentorship and possibly funding comes from our guests. So when our guests come here, we actually take them to see self-help groups and smaller companies and initiatives and be like, would you like to invest in this? Would you like to build something from this? Whether that's handicrafts or handlooms or other, cultural ventures. And apart from this, we also like when our guests come here, we look at them as investors. So when you come to Mayurbhanj and you go to a village and you spend time in understanding pottery and you purchase a certain amount of pottery, you spend time in, actually paying for a class of pottery in an offbeat village, you're investing in that community from one chai to a biscuit to actually paying the artisan a fair amount to learn his trade. So we have to look at these kind of places as startups, and really at the core of it has to be, how are you sustainable to the community, including environmental reasons. So reducing your carbon footprint and giving back.
I'm sure we'll get her back in a minute.
Hi, sorry, did you lose me?
Yes, you're back. It's fine.
Great. Yeah, so sorry, I just want to say how the property can be self-reliant and reduce its carbon footprint. So like I said, I'm going to take you through the story of my family through its architecture. So the first ruins we actually found of our first home or fort was Kiching. So the family comes from Kichinga Mandala, and this was the Bhanja dynasty still at this point. During the excavations in the 1920s, which one of my ancestors had done with the British, it was one of the first, it led to the first archaeological department of the state, and it had two of the Orisa's earliest museums. They realized that there was a temple which was in the middle of this fort, and they excavated the entire temple almost intact. And it was called the Kiching Temple. It's extremely famous because it houses one of our idols of Chamunda. Chamunda is a goddess of war and famine. And this area of Mayurbhanj and the Bhanja dynasty have always worshipped the female form, Shakti. And it's important which rulers worship which goddesses, because it emulated their thought processes, their values. Now, I've taken a little close up on the right, and as you can see, it's a goddess form, and you can see the immaculate craftsmanship that has gone in creating one single brick on that massive temple. And this is all done in the 8th century, between the 6th to 8th century. And so you can see how extremely skilled the craftsmen would have been to actually come here and sort of build this over decades. The rest of the excavation hasn't still happened, but near the excavation, they also found rocks that dated back to Paleolithic ages. So it kind of shows you that there were human civilization in Mayurbhanj, more than thousands of years. It's very interesting in how people have survived in this region. And something I wanted to mention is the word Bhanja and Moor got added. One, the Moor came from the peacock folklore, but Moor also came from the word Maurya, because if any of you have heard of, the great kings of India, Ashoka is one of them, from the Mauryan Empire. And there's a tale, promoted by some of the historians, that a Mauryan princess would have married a Bhanja king. And that's how it became Mayurbhanj, and the British couldn't pronounce it, so they called it Mayurbhanj, because Mayur in Hindi means peacock, so the peacock dynasty. From Kiching, I wanted to take you to Haripur in the 1400s. Most people assume that, why didn't royal families fight the British? Well, because we were fighting each other. There was no India, there were just different states. Mayurbhanj was a country, just like any other country. And so you just had 575 countries, each with their own cuisine, dress, language. And so this was Haripur. Again, what is an interesting fact is all the architectures that survived from our previous forts and palaces were temples. The locals have, of course, the saying that, the goddesses were so powerful that they didn't let any enemy invader destroy them or take them. Because as you know, in most Indian princely states and also in the modern country, a lot of the jewelry and gold and how rich a state was how rich its temples were. And so this is another excavated site where we've got the Rasakarai Temple, and it's very similar to the Bishnupur temples you find in Bengal. So interesting how, we think of countries with borders and passports and visas, but there are no borders, and cultures don't stop when a border ends or starts. So this is the mixing of the East Indian cultures, right up from Bengal all the way coming through to Orissa. And as you can see in this as well, this is us taking a few of our guests to go visit it. But something interesting here is that, interesting in that was that this is a big, baked brick terracotta buildings, and each of them would have also had little carvings of royal life. So you have processions, you have weddings, you have musical instruments, you have song and dance. Something to remember is when you look at architecture, they kind of tell you a little bit of that time. And art and culture only flourish when there is peace. There is no art to be had when there is war. So something interesting about the Bhanjas, and maybe why they were also supported by the people, was there was peace in that state. And the reasons why these palaces and forts were getting destroyed was actually because of invasions coming in. And most people would assume, well, who was invading you, in the 1400s? it was actually the Marathas who had pindaris, which are mercenaries. These were paid warriors to kill. So they come with the intention of, sort of burning all the crops, poisoning the waters, and taking loot. And so it's interesting that what the Bhanja warriors really were promulgating was what we call today as guerrilla warfare. We retreat into forests and fight you in, sort of country areas where we know the landscape better. So when we had to move from the 1400s in Haripur, there's one fort that's missing that was burnt down around the 1700s. Now, so we don't have that picture, but what you are looking at right now is the main Mayurbhanj Palace. So there were 3 palaces, one in Mayurbhanj, one in Shillong, the Summer Palace, and one in Calcutta, the Raja Bagh Palace. So something important about the Mayurbhanj Palace and why actually, because Mimi had asked me a great question. She said, well, your buildings look really European, but they were built in the early 1800s by, it was built by a British engineer. So how did your family have a connection to the British, which got me thinking. And then I re-looked at our archives and I realized that something to note about my family is we were part of the dynasty called the Bhaumakara. So we were already a principality in a ruling kingdom. The Bhaumakara dynasty is very noteworthy in Indian history because they had a matrilineal line. That means that if you didn't have a son, the royal lineage passes through daughters. And so when we look at when we look at our regional archives, you notice that the word for a ruler does not gender, it's not masculine or feminine. It just means ruler or leader. It has no, it was the British who couldn't understand how men were letting a woman rule. We have to understand these were Victorian, very formal, if I may say, decorums, which Indians didn't follow. So even from our temples, it has a lot of erotic scriptures. There was a lot of fluidity between genders. And so we had someone called Rani Sumitra Devi. She actually commanded an army that stopped the Maratha invasion from going into Bengal, which was where the British and the French had their bases. This is before Battle of Plassey, before the mutiny. And so she actually helped the British by stopping the Marathas from coming into Bengal and pushing them out of Cuttack. And Cuttack is much more south of Arisa. So the land of Mayurbhanj, what you see today, was much, much bigger in size. It was cut off on the north, on the east, on the south, and the west. But what you're looking at was this was gifted to her by the British for her bravery and for being able to command 1,000 cavalrymen to stop, at the time, what we call the most ruthless invaders. And so she built what was, the Mayurbhanj Palace. And there's an interesting anecdote here because apparently someone wrote saying that, a queen in India is looking for an engineer in Europe to design a building. And people wrote that I'm not going to be, no matter what the money is, I'm not going to be making a building for an Indian, especially a woman. And so at the time, the court wrote back, someone was asked like, well, what would you like the building to look like? We're not getting engineers. And someone replied back saying, well, what's the biggest palace in Europe and in England? Let's make that, but bigger. And so there was a very European, neoclassical, Victorian look and feel to the palace. And I think it was a little bit of ego and personality, in terms of that Indians and East Indian and women can also make architectural wonders. Moving on, so this is when the main Mayurbhanj Palace was made. We also made a guest house. It was actually a European house for visiting dignitaries who came to invest in Mayurbhanj. Now, this is important because they already saw a reason to work with the British, because what history doesn't tell you is what happened to families that didn't work with the British. And that's important because working with the British, it's survival instinct. You have fight or flight. So the Belgadia Palace is built very similar in neoclassical with Doric and Corinthian columns. And it was built for Europeans who were visiting. Royal families didn't live with Europeans. There was still a divide in how they look. Hi, am I audible?
Yes, fine. Everything is fine.
So, but the right is the main Mayurbhanj Palace, and I did want to show that to you because when you look straight, you're looking through 4 courtyards and 8 on the right. All the three Mayurbhanj palaces, the one in Shillong, in Bengal, in Calcutta, and the one in Mayurbhanj itself, were at the time of post-independence, were given back to the states they came from. So Meghalaya has the first IIM, which was previously the palace. West Bengal has a vocational training institute for higher learning in Calcutta. And Mayurbhanj main palace was given to become a girls' high school and college. So the family in the 40s itself realized that what democracy needed was education. And so they moved out of all the palaces they had. along with everything that was in the palaces. And they moved into what we now know as Belgadia Palace, which is what you're looking at on the left from 100 years ago. So before I come to what is now Mayurbhanj and a little bit about the land and what you visually are missing from being here, was the fact that what really happened to princely states from the 20th century. Because in Indian syllabuses, most of us learn the British syllabus, and we kind of we have to understand that the British understood public relations maybe a bit better than us. So a lot of what we know is how they portrayed royalty to be sort of either effeminate or children, womenizers or drinking alcohol. So there was sort of a lot of glamour, which took away from a lot of the administrative infrastructure, legal, and sort of what really built the fabric of the modern democracy. So something I wanted to mention was one of my ancestors, Maharaj Sri Ram Chandra Bhanj Deo, really promoted education. He brought the first museums into the state. He had a senate. His father actually had a senate in the 1800s. So one tribal leader, an indigenous community's leader, had to come to Baripuda, and there was a senate built where each leader had to agree on what laws were passed or not passed. This is what you call a makings of the modern democracy, very close to what we're looking at the parliament and the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. This is the late 1800s in Mayurbhanj. And what they did in the 1900s was actually make it a constitutional monarchy in the 1930s. The king actually became a servant of the constitutional monarchy. So Mayurbhanj was actually in 1949 one of the last princely states to accede to the Indian Union. So very famously, when Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel wrote to His Highness of Mayurbhanj saying that, Your Highness, Mayurbhanj will have to accede to the Indian Union, His Highness replied by saying, Mayurbhanj is already a democracy, sir. India needs to catch up. Unfortunately, this was similar to when you think of Spain and Catalonia, a state so powerful enough that they had the vision of democracy. If I look at my great-grandfather's diaries in the early 1900s, he called monarchy a ruse. He said the British are using us as puppets, and the people have no idea. We're losing connection with our people, because a lot of princes were forced to go to British schools. There was doctrine of lapse was emblazoned into our legal code, because they didn't want royal families to have a connection to the people, speak the same tongue, understand that we ourselves came from the indigenous communities we belong to. So that's my sister. So now back to Mayurbhanj. We're in the 21st century right now. That's my sister looking over Simlipal. Mayurbhanj is landlocked, but is only half an hour from the beach, and Belgaria is half an hour from the beach, Chandipur, and half an hour from the 6th largest national park in India, and also Asia's 2nd largest biosphere. So a lot of green forest cover, a lot of rich natural resources, and we've got a thriving wildlife. And apart from that, 2 of India's largest waterfalls, Joranda and Barepani. And this is the colonial map on the right, but as you can see, the kind of, all the other princely states that surrounded it. I'm going to move on to the right. You look at the communities. So this is the heart of Mayurbhanj, its people. We have one of the highest concentration of Adivasi communities in India. This includes Santhal being the most popular, but you also have Ho, Munda, Bhuyan, and a number of others. On the left, you're looking at the last calendar entry that I managed to save when we were restoring it because of it being in good condition. And I'm not sure if you can zoom in, but if you do zoom in, you'll see ruler, you'll see Raj family members on the left and right, because they have formed the administration. But what's interesting is if you look down, you'll start seeing the ministries the Mayurbhanj royal family had started. So it was a parliament, there was a district collector, a court, a Supreme Court, there was a printing press, there was a bank, there were currencies, and they actually had something which is the Ministry of Development, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Welfare, I think there's a Ministry of the State Band, Ministry of Chhau. So they really understood that to preserve this state, we're going to have to move the same people, the same things we prioritize into a democratic fold. And on the right is a Santhal dance. And, as you can see, it's a vibrant culture and community. And now I want to stop at this vibrant culture and community and tell you about a little bit of how Arisa is viewed today. So on the right, you're looking at a map from the early 2000s, which called, this is the Red Corridor. If you're students of politics like I am, political history has fascinated me and, kind of the ebbs and flows of democracy. But the Red Corridor were places where there were counterinsurgency and there were conflict. So tourism was banned. You'll have laws in place which allow the police to roam more freely. Indigenous communities and the police force have had a tepid history. And on the left, we have a nice cocktail of natural disasters. And this is sort of been upheaved because of man-made reasons. But this was a clipping from the New York Times. And I took a screenshot of this because I would never want, I want my generation to be the last when one of the world's most powerful newspapers refuses to name the state they're talking about, but calling us a poor state. So when I was so excited because we had a cyclone and we weren't getting enough press from the national media. And I heard from a friend saying, New York Times writing a story about Orissa. And they're writing a story about how great Orissa is managing the cyclone, how they managed to save 1 million people. But they didn't even think it was important to name us. And if someone meets you, but they refuse to take your name, it's too complicated, I can't pronounce it. I'm sure many Indians have heard that. It takes away your agency and your power to tell your story in your own words. And so I hope that when we think of historic properties, we're not just changing, we're hoping to bring in development and social impact. I hope we realize we're changing a state's narrative and agency. We're taking back our power and our agency, and we will be spoken in the way we deserve and we are valued. So moving on the left, I found my family tree history, which dates back 1,000 years. And as you can understand, this is why in school, when they told us to draw family trees when I was in kindergarten, I would just write adopted. That was a joke. And, so when you have a family tree of 1,000 years, it's very hard to remember every name and where everyone went. But it's extremely fascinating when you're a student of history. Something really interesting here is you see men's names and then you see a woman's name, Rani Sumitra Devi, Rani Jagannath Devi. And this is important because that meant that, through the annals of time, women were recognized as rulers, and the British would call them regents. But the word regent does not translate into our local languages because the British needed to conform and categorize us and stratify us, but that did not exist for our communities. On the right is the most famous ruler of the Bhanj dynasty, His Highness Maharaja Sri Ramchandra Bhanj Deo. He was a fascinating gentleman, and I'll come to a little love story if we have time of his, similar to Edward and Wallace Simpson, something I was extremely fascinated by. But he was born to a father who recognized the need for a senate, recognized the need for his sons to be educated abroad, but also understand what their communities were like. So even though he spoke indigenous languages, he actually helped one of the indigenous communities write their script down because they were oral storytellers, and he helped them write the script down in actual in ink. So, fascinating gentleman, traveled the world, and he loved to travel offbeat countries, which are not part of the Commonwealth, which was extremely rare for Indian princes. So he would go to Japan, Madagascar, America, Southeast Asia. He wanted to know how did democracy flourish, how did communities flourish in places outside the Commonwealth. Because you need to understand that as much as we are brainwashed with the news today, they were also very carefully kept in a tight bubble. Something I want to mention is the women of Mayurbhanj, because it's so important, and they were feminists. So, even my ancestors were part of, one of my ancestors, not by blood, but she was the Maharani of Mayurbhanj, His Highness Sri Ramchandra Bhanj Deo's second wife. She was the head of the All India Women's Bengal Federation. They spoke about feminism way before we understood it today, but they believed in equality. And, over the centuries, you see in the late 1800s, Mayurbhanj had a few schools, 50, 60. And suddenly you see in the early 1900s, 4,000 schools, sporting stadiums, you see sanitation initiatives, you see rehabilitation centers, so it was fascinating how they were, conceiving of learning from the British cultural milieus, but taking the best from it and trying to retain their values. This is one of the Maharani Mayurbhanj's sister, the Maharani of Cooch Behar, Suniti Devi. But I use this picture as reference because they dressed very alike. And when they went for the Delhi Darbar in the early 1900s, British tabloids wrote a lot about these two sisters who had walked in with a sari, but they had the sort of the can of the Victorian ball gowns with the corset, and they had sort of kept a sash like the army generals do in Europe, with the medals that they had earned because of their state. and they wore the tiara, but they had used a lot of Indian embroidery and material, and one of my ancestors used to use Dokra, which is a lost wax metal casting technique, to fashion jewelry, Art Deco jewelry. So they used Indian craftsmanship to keep at par with European style and sensibilities that suited them, but at the same time holding their own space. So that's a newspaper cutting from Australia in the 1930s. The only reason I kept that is because a lot of people abolished the parda and did not wear it. But I think it's fascinating that Australian newspapers were writing about my ancestors in the 1930s. So I want to come to restoration and revival. So, family history, a lot of happening in terms of historical and political terms. And, I hope you understand a little bit of the socioeconomic circumstances. This is, so what we got from Bulgaria, and this is the last remnant of our family left. So when we were looking at restoring it, we were sure that it had to be something that it has lasted 200 years, it will last another 200. And that's something I feel like I'm not sure modern architects always think of. How does this serve the community? Will it last 200 years? What will people think in 200 years? How will they use it? And we wanted to think of that. So we had got little pieces of all the three palaces, and we used doors to become tables, doorknobs to become accessories. We used old locks to become wall hangings. We made our gargoyles fashioned into, a new style, parts of the bench in iron, terracotta. Then we've also been opened only 1 year. So, I hope you all understand that this is part of this in the vision. But we wanted to, so Cyclone Phony hit us our first year of opening. Fantastic to have a cyclone, the first year of opening a hotel. But we spun it because all the trees that fell, we cut them up very aesthetically to become tables and chairs. So nothing goes to waste in this house. And we got an architect on board who really helped us at how historic buildings can still be, to a certain extent, eco-friendly and green. So, changing the energy fixtures, the light bulbs, the plumbing, the wiring, what are modern amenities we can bring in, what are older elements we want to keep, what can be decoration. For example, a lot of this house would have been fountains and, very beautification of gardening. So we said, no, we're going to become a farm to table. So we actually got, we were gardening. We're about 30%, when we started being organic last year. It takes about 2-3 years for certifications to come in. Much to the dismay of my late grandmother, we got cows and chickens and goats, and we were like, okay, we're going to make sure that every part of this property is going to benefit us, the guests who come here, and any excess actually goes to support our neighboring communities. And so I want to come to this point, because when people think of historic communities, they're saying, okay, great, tourism, great, protect an endangered folk art, or protect an NGO, support, and that's philanthropy. For us, it was about a holistic view. So when we, talk about tourism, heritage is not just, especially heritage tourism is not just an employer, it's also a multiplier. So, it goes into different folds and facets. So for us, it was also, how do we bring education skills up to power? So as soon as we started the Belgadia Palace and had it registered, we also registered the Mayurbhanj Foundation. So 10% we knew that in 1 year, we were going to calculate how many guests we got, and 10% of the funds would be funneled right into the Mayurbhanj Foundation. So if anyone wanted to make a donation right off the bat, they could do that as well. And the Mayurbhanj Foundation could only be used for, the funds can only be used to be regenerated back into the community. Apart from that, was also a sense of place, right? So we had Cyclone Amphan. So great to be hit with a global pandemic and then, one of the worst cyclones. So what happened was we opened up the doors of Cyclone Amphan for if anyone was, Orissa Tourism actually helped us promote it. So if anyone was outside and couldn't get home during the cyclone, we were like, come and stay with us. So we actually tried to we want to try and build more shelters, which are, natural disaster friendly, but also because people should feel that we are a community house. When the schools had closed down, my mother actually invited the local children in for a month to actually take classes online, so they don't miss that schedule. We had an art exhibition last year, which was fully funded by the family, just so that local artists, international artists, and regional artists could come together, and then people could have stalls. Again, how every facet of our events, our collaborations, our partnerships, our day-to-day running has to think of the community. What is their need? Do they need us right now in a way that that's stronger than we realize. I thought the personal development, how are you hiring locally, sourcing locally, using local brands. So for example, we had NGOs who wanted to donate. We would reach out to them, invite them to Mayurbhanj, build a roadmap of how they could invest in Mayurbhanj. So we are your point of contact. If you want in any way to collaborate with us, would you like to do stone carvings? Great, we'll take you to a stone carving village and you can give them your orders and we'll make sure you get the finest quality products. We are your point of contact to invest in the district and get the best of its talent and help that talent who needs it. Of course, the environment, and then the quality of life. In terms of, a lot of people think that, it's just a historic property, can only be there as a living museum, or it can only be there for the art. There's some sort of disconnect with what it can be today. So for us, it was really important that people thought of it as like mentally, physically, spiritually. So a sense of like yoga, spirituality, development. So a lot of our retreats, our first year, were actually geared towards health and wellness. I'm just going to move on because I did want to come across some of the highlights. So for example, right off the bat, single-use plastic was banned. We had to have waste segregation and composting. So it's not just the idea, it's the execution. So you may not have plastic, but how are you throwing out your trash? We hire and source local material. We started nutritional organic farming. We used all our building materials as much as we could from old furniture. We tried not to buy anything new, except we realized that, we needed new flushes and new plumbing and new lights and, things that were just a little like, we're using old lights, but with maybe new bulbs. So what we had to do to become a modern contemporary hotel, yes, we did. But that was maybe 10%, the rest of it was a lot in restoration, getting the right architects. We realized the house was built with local stone, Makoro. So we actually wanted to keep that. We didn't want cement, we didn't want asbestos, we didn't want too much brick. It was made by eggshells, honey, and lime at some point. So it was really important to us to understand how it was built and how we can preserve that kind of building. Even for our decor and our art pieces, a lot of it was sourced locally from the region. And what was really important for us was partnering with academic institutions. So we had interns who actually lived with us for a month, and they were sustainability management interns. So they taught us how to do sustainable practices on a day-to-day basis. We hire local staff. So once I remember a guest was there, and she very sweetly, while leaving, she said, "Oh, I just want to let you know, I know your staff is hired locally. Some of them can't speak English. They're extremely hospitable and friendly. But I had asked him to turn my geyser on, and I'm not sure he did that or something. And I just want to check with you." So I asked my staff. I said, "Oh, did you not turn the geyser on?" And I realized that he had no idea what a geyser switch was. You're hiring people straight from a rural tribal village, and you're sending them into what is a 21st century hotel. And he was extremely apologetic. And I said, "No, not at all. I'm going to teach you this." So when you say hire locally, you need to understand that you're doing research and development. You're investing in that person, in that person's family, and you're making sure he's trained to a point that he can get a job after this. His children may have better jobs than this. So we make sure that we tie up with local tourism management schools, and they actually take our staff and train them. So they don't feel that if they don't speak English, they can't become hospitality managers, because they can. They're so willing to learn. And on the left, just really quickly, bullet points would be energy, water conservation, of course, as I mentioned, recycling and waste production. And when I mentioned bath amenities, cleaning products, and food preparation, what I'm basically talking about is also homegrown brands. How can we use local organic spices? How can we partner with brands who are sustainable at their core? And I really believe that responsible travel is about not just the tourists who come in and use that space responsibly and that time responsibly, but also it's for the people from that community to feel pride in their community, to regenerate some kind of responsibility in them to preserve their community. And like I mentioned, yoga was a big part of it, spirituality, guided meditation. A lot of hotels have doctors on calls. We actually have a therapist on call, because we realized, COVID-19 travel and COVID-19 pandemic is here to stay. Travel needs to keep up with those times. We want people to mentally feel at ease. We want indigenous practices inculcated. We do have a spa. We have a the local massages. Nothing has to be emulated. We're not trying to emulate Rajasthan's tourism strategy or Kerala's or Europe's. That's never. Then we're going to fail. We're going to try to be the best that Mayurbhanj can be. And that's where our strength lies. This is a reference picture, but our spices were important to us. Like, how is our food cooked? Our chef goes in the morning with his sabai basket, which is a handmade handicraft of Mayurbhanj, and he plucks flowers and roots and, you know, barks of trees. And our guests are always like, what, we're eating like literally a flower from that tree, and the edible leaves. So utilize indigenous knowledge, because they have such a knowledge of the food and how they eat and what's seasonal, what's fresh, what's organic, and taking parts of flowers and plants we would never have thought to eat. So our cuisine comes from that as well. Just a little more on the fact that, you know, when we say responsible tourism, it's low impact. You're not trying to overburden the existing ecosystem. You're trying to make sure it's you know, creating employment and supplemental income and livelihoods, but also it's a positive experience on the whole. It's something that's going to last, you know, and kind of mold with the times. Something we did was also we've switched, because I just want to quickly harp on that, is online fitness and wellness classes. So we curate the experience for you, you know, whether having a therapist on call, whether making sure your menu has Ayurvedic drinks, and it's fit all with indigenous recipes and knowledge. Moving on, in terms of restoration, a lot of people were like, well, doesn't the property just look really new? And we wanted to stress that you can have, you know, you could sort of, this was a picture from the left of the main palace in Mayurbhanj, just in the picture on the right. So we literally took the blueprint of what was already there and sort of fitted the space with a little new amenities, but mostly keeping the furniture intact. We had no reason to buy anything. You know, old upholstery became curtains, or, you know, we made sure that the two right panels you see on the far end of the middle column are Pattachitra on Tassar, which is a form of fabric. So as much as we could use local decor, that was what we would use in the space. This is an important slide because a lot of people don't talk about the before and after. It's always like royalty is like glorious. But these properties are white elephants. And because of the kind of taxes that were levied on royalty right after, you know, the privy purses hardly amounted to 2-3% of our total GDP from the 40s. And these privy purses didn't increase with inflation or deflation. So these properties just bled over time, you know, and restoration and maintenance of these properties is extremely hard. So this was the before picture, and this was a picture of the right. As you can see, that is a tremendous change. A lot by you know, the furniture, a lot by looking at old pictures, a lot by seeing what's already there. Nothing had to be refashioned or created. This is what the house looks like from the insides now. This is actually a room that's broken down to become one room. There used to be a door which led to the second part. I don't know if anyone's a fan of Downton Abbey or The Crown, or because there are a lot of similarities I make, but basically women and men didn't always live together. Women like their own space as much as men do. And so, you know, there'd be a common room that, you know, they would have separate beds, but they would have a marriage bed. So it's interesting how the architecture of these spaces have to now conform to a bit of a modern style. All this furniture was built on the property by local craftsmen. And this was actually my grandfather's gift to my grandmother. So it's called the Narayan Hiti suite. My grandmother was the daughter of King Tribhuvan of Nepal. She was a princess of Nepal. So the suite was kind of in her tastes and her choices. So each room is fashioned on the taste of one of the royalty and personalities who lived there. The room on the right is the Bengal Renaissance room. And you know, it's each of the, you know, some of these pictures have some of the art pieces. So all the heirlooms and all our objects are directly, which were owned by the royalty. And we've kept a few of them to kind of give you an idea of who these personalities were. So Maharaja Sri Ram Chandra Bhanj Deo's second wife was actually Keshab Chandra Sen, the leader of the Bengal Renaissance, the Brahma Samaj movement, which was a movement, was kind of an offshoot of basically, it was kind of like the Renaissance movement in Europe, very much so, but people who promoted philosophy, education, you know, women's education, the banning of sati, widow remarriage, you know, banning children's marriage. And so my ancestor fell in love with her when he was 18, and he wanted to marry her. And when he came back and told his, because, you know, royalty doesn't marry who they want. They don't have a lot of choice. Their first love has to be their kingdom. So he came back and told his parliament, I found a girl I want to marry. And they were like the daughter of a rebel, the daughter of, you know, they've broken off from Brahmanism, and they've become Brahmos, and they promote all this science and technology and women studying. And so they didn't allow him to marry her. And so 18 years later, when he married a Rajput princess and they had 3 lovely children, I'm the descendant of that marriage, he actually lost his wife and his youngest daughter because of smallpox. And when he went back to Calcutta after his world travels, around the same time he was investing in the Tatas, he went to a party, and I like to imagine that's a jazz party in Calcutta in a very cool setting. he realized that Sucharu Devi, the woman who he actually liked when he was a boy, had not married. She never got married because she'd always been in love with him. And so he actually went back to his people and he gave a really big speech. It became really popular for a lot of books in Oriya, which was, in Hinduism, we have something called dharma and karma. Dharma is duty, karma is your destiny. And he said, I did my duty. I married a Rajput princess from a neighboring family. I was betrothed to her by my father, but I've done my duty and this is now my destiny. And so he wrote a letter to her family saying that, can you forgive me, and will you be my spiritual companion in this world and the next? And the parliament said to him that if you dare marry her, when he had told this 18 years ago, they said abdicate the throne. And it was called the scandal that rocked the capital. And because she came from an aristocratic Bengal family in Calcutta, the capital, and he was, a young prince of a massive state. This time he said, and the family said that if you marry her, we won't let her enter the palace, the one you looked at, the Buckingham facade. And so he said, okay, fine. And then he came to Bulgaria and he renovated Bulgaria suited to her interests. So the house I live in today was actually the meeting point of this love story. So she had 2 children, and this is where when she came to visit, this was the palace built for her because she was not allowed in the main palace. So this room was actually inspired by her lineage and her story, and our homage to that love story by creating the Bengal Renaissance room. This is the library downstairs, just a bit of a reading corner, but it's got some fantastic books, limited edition and first edition, Rabindranath Tagore, Virginia Woolf, C.S. Lewis, also Casanova, and a lot of spiritual books. So very interesting reads of what they thought was, of course, Grimm's fairy tales, and Arabian Nights, but very interesting because these people basically brought the world to them. They never needed to leave because if they liked someone, they'd invite them to come give a speech, like Dr. Annie Besant, the Irish theosophist. So they called Annie Besant to come give a speech in Baripada of the women's emancipation movement, and also, how Indians should fight for freedom in the 1920s. So it's fascinating that they lived this what I like to call the jazz age life, at least in the 1920s and 30s. This is just a picture of this is Sucharu Devi's daughter, Joyati, and she's driving a car, and apparently she was known to go to the barracks in Fort William in Calcutta, and she would dare English soldiers to race with her, and she would beat them. So fascinating lady, and she did a lot with her life. On the left is what used to be the sepoy, the part of the state army. So the armies were disbanded of most royal families, but it's important to note over here, I'm just going to check the time. It's important to note over here that when the army was disbanded after the 1857 mutiny, a lot of them started practicing a dance form called Chhau, Mayurbhanj Chhau. It comes from the word Chhauni, which means frontier. And it's similar to the origin story of capoeira in Brazil. So the soldiers would tell the British they're dancing because they can dance. But actually they would be practicing martial arts forms if the king ever needed them to fight a war. What you see on the right is an offshoot of Chhau. It's the Purulia Chhau, which wears masks. Mayurbhanj does not wear a mask. But I like this picture because you see how village life centers around arts and culture. And, we want our guests to feel part of this community, not a part of it. On the left, like I showed you, was us taking our guests to Haripur and actually being able to, really understand very close up what each of these bricks and what story they told. This was, one of our guests asked us, but don't you have swimming pools? And we said, why would you want a swimming pool when I'll take you to 1,000 virgin waterfalls? And so we take them to hot springs and waterfalls. And it's a much more earthy experience than Downton Abbey, I suppose. But on the right, we partner, another reason for us is we partner with travel companies and operators who also understand what conscious luxury and sustainable tourism is. And one of them is Grassroots Travel. Another one that we're part of is the Rare group of boutique properties, which a lot of erstwhile royal families who are doing social impact are part of, because we have to be sustainable. We have to have our sustainability manifesto and our social impact manifesto. So how much have you given back to which NGOs? How has that, what does that look like? And something we never expected our guests to do was, we had guests and they stopped and they said, what is that? And I said, that's rice farming. And they were like, can we do it? And you realize how alien urban civilizations have become, that we don't even know the food we eat, where it comes from. So it's thrilling for us when we take back this rustic rural living and actually reintroduce it to a global audience. On the left is Pattachitra, which is basically a form of artisanal drawing and design, and it's fascinating because a lot of it is made from handmade dye as well. And it's also our tribal and indigenous experiences. I had spoken about this, where a lot of people think of tribal tourism and it's about like clicking a picture and watching them dance, and that's not what we promote at all. Please leave your phones at home and come with us and engage in conversation, sit and have a meal with them, or you prepare the meal with them, and you can follow them around, and they are really in control of how you will be interacting with them. Some of them love teaching you instruments and dances. Some of them might want you to help them paint their walls. And we actually try to explain to guests that, there's no money exchange in this. But for example, if you would like to understand how to do Pattachitra from an old artisan family, you can pay her. What we do is we don't charge for taking the guests to these villages and places, but we do expect you to sort of, if you're paying them for their time, if you're spending time with them and you're sort of, learning their craft, we try to set a market linkages, and we don't charge for that. Something again I wanted to talk about was the cuisine of Arisa. It's really interesting. And one really famous chef of India called it root to fruit cooking. And that's really what we wanted to do. So, outdoor cooking, something really famous. Our delicacy is muri mangso. It's mutton curry with puffed rice. And it was apparently something that the invading Mauryan army had Rajput armies had sort of come to Orissa and learn how to cook. So it was very famous during Shikar. But also it's like, we take our guests to local bazaars and huts where they actually, tribal communities, some might be a fisherman's community, some might be a forest dwelling community, some might be a little more city oriented. And they come with their their crafts, crops, cattle, and they sometimes even do barter. So we let our guests be part of that experience. This is something important because there are 3 festivals I like to focus on. If you're from Orissa, there's an old saying in Orissa that we have 12 months and 13 festivals. Every month in Orissa is some festival, and we absolutely love it. There's one festival of a tribal community where the girls and boys they kind of have what looks like a party. There are dances and songs, and the girls have to go around talking to boys and sort of choose a boy they want to marry. So boys usually perform dances for the girls. I think it's an absolutely fascinating way that should be implemented in cities, maybe. But you have something called the Rathyatra. It's called the car festival. And basically what you do is there are 3 gods and goddesses who are put on chariots, these massive, if you can kind of see, they're looking like kind of tombs. And they are, they have a little bit of, they have the deity sitting inside, they're taking out in the temple, and they're pulled, massive chariots are pulled by thousands of women and men. And Mayurbhanj is really famous because it's the only place where Subhadra's chariot, the goddess's chariot, can only be pulled by women. So you have thousands of women, all castes, creeds, and ages, and they come from all over the world, and no man can pull that chariot, only women can. And this is a picture from my great-grandfather doing the same thing in the 1910s. He's actually riding an elephant, so he's leading the sort of chariot. And what royal families in Orissa do is they take a broom, which is supposed to be a golden broom, and they have to sweep the chariot. And it signifies the fact that no king is above God. And he, that day, sweeps the floor for all the people to then pull the chariot. It doesn't start with the king doing that. And this is my sister on the left. And I did this ceremony last year with my family present. I was there with my family while my father did it, but it was the first time that I don't have a brother. So the 444th year that my family did this, and a girl was part of the ceremony with her father. I also want to talk about how you take from the erstwhile princely times and bring it to suit modern sensibilities. So my family had the tradition of patronage. So we had an artist called Hemendranath Majumdar. If you don't know him, please look him up. He's a national treasure, which actually is a thing, which means that he's an artist who has national, international acclaim. And he was called the last romantic painter. He painted these very sensuous images of women doing these, and there's a huge history behind him as an artist. If you look, and something that was important was, we took the idea of patronage and we made it artist residencies. So Hemendranath Majumdar actually came to Belgaria and lived in this palace because that's where the guests lived and dignitaries lived. And he painted for different portraits of my ancestors, as well as painted some of his best works. And we actually started the artist residency program for emerging artists. So the pictures on the right were taken by a young artist called Vaidehi Khandelwal. She goes by @Camrawali on Instagram. And she stayed with us, and she actually did a she did workshops with local youth in the community to teach them about photography. And what she also did was then take shots of the architecture of the palace. So you take from what your ancestors did and kind of put it in a contemporary relevant format. This is just like 2 nights at the this is something we offer our guests, is 2 nights at Belgadia and what that looks like. As you can see, we also have croquet, which was a game that me and my sister had to figure out what exactly it was by YouTubing it. But it was great to see that our people in this house were Europeans. So everything in the house was sort of, every room had a bar and vinyl record players and jazz CDs. And they had, they had the old projector rooms and billiards tables. And so it was always meant to be a leisure house for dignitaries mingling and diplomatic tables set up. But what we wanted to take from it, and this is where I'm going to, towards the end of the presentation, so I'm going to just focus on what social practice is like. We've partnered with 7 brands for our boutique store and for the property, which are from the Eastern region. And we have 2 criteria for the brands. You have to be eco-conscious and sustainable, and you have to show us how you are, from your production line to your sourcing. And you have to have women in leadership positions. So either women are directors or co-founders, or they work. They're not just the employees and making these bags or table sets or cloths. They're actually heading these companies. We also had 500 guests in the past 1 year and 2,500 visitors. When we had our art exhibition, we actually had 5,000 students come to the property, and we spoke to each one of them about the history of Mayurbhanj, about the story of Mayurbhanj. And for a lot of these students who are from class 5 to class 12, they never knew of the royal family. They never really understood what the family had done. They just, it was a folklore of this land was ruled by kings. It's important to tell them their history, but by telling them things like your ancestors fought in wars, your ancestors built palaces, your ancestors participated in democracy. We also had 2 artist residencies. Like I mentioned, one was Vaidehi and one was a grant given by the New Zealand government to compare Maori culture with Santhal culture. So it was actually a grant given to 2 artists from New Zealand who came and stayed with us for 6 to 8 weeks. And that was fascinating as well. We've also had 3 partnerships with NGOs. The 3 main crafts that we support is Dokra, which is, if any of you know the dancing girl from the Harappan civilization, it's the same format. Dokra is not unique to Mayurbhanj. It's spread during indigenous communities, but it is an endangered art form. So we actually help in design and innovation with local nonprofits and communities where we can, and we procure their Dokra to put in the palace. So when you walk around, if you like the lamp or you like the Dokra coaster, you can buy it. And we take that money and give it back to the communities. So it's a living museum, but there are a lot of things on sale at the palace which are made by artisans. So we bring the artisans into the palace for you to give them that platform. The other partnership is Project Chhauni. Chhauni is the Mayurbhanj Chhau's art form, which was patronized by my family for over 200 years. And it's something that, it's very interesting because Chhau is a dying art form, but now it's actually being revived by women. So women were never allowed to participate in Chhau. And as it was declining and it became endangered, families were forcing daughters and women in the family to participate in this dance form. And women took it up with such gusto that it's being revived yet again. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was, us partnering and actually trying to work with UNESCO to identify and GI tag our artisan villages and clusters so they get more of a tourism and marketing platform by the government. And also make sure that if you have a dying art and craft, UNESCO, the UN, our state government, our districts know that it's dying and make noise about it so you can protect it. Like I said, we also do yoga retreats and artist getaways and weekends, because we cannot only, there is a section of society who are historic lovers, but some people may not understand the value of it. So, making sure we also we have a contemporary significance when we do our marketing. So, younger audiences and young creative professionals are drawn in to create bodies and works of arts here. So we do a lot of getaways for artist collaborations, artists from all over the world. I think our furthest away was someone from Brooklyn. Also, we've tied up with academic institutions for grants and research. We worked with a college in Bhubaneswar, and something that's close to my heart was we did a lot of PR, and a lot of people asked us, well, that's a lot of media, and I get kind of scared when someone's like, you are there yet, because we're not there. I don't think we're there yet, but we have a very strong vision. But for me, it was really important that people felt pride in what we were doing or trying to do and reached out to us, because it's very hard when you're in a room with people from, other places which are much more famous and have been tourist states and districts, and their palaces are more famous. And I wanted people from Orissa to feel like our state had enough to put it on the global map as well. And our history was something that was retold. So, as soon as we started doing some marketing, we got a lot of people who helped us with, archiving it, digitizing the footage. So it's not always about, so for a lot of historic properties, the idea is, we don't have the money and the government's not helping us. But honestly, if you start putting the word out there that this is what we want to do, this is our vision, people will come forward and they'll say, okay, let's do it like this. We got interns and we got a volunteer program. The person saying, I can't afford, I couldn't stay in your house for 6 months, but can I come and volunteer? Can I do photography workshops? Great. We'll put the cost of stay on us. You come and help us open up a curriculum in the nearby college and school. Or we had NGOs who said, okay, we want to do something in India. And I said, great, we'll devise a roadmap to how you can implement, your sustainable ventures in Mayurbhanj. And so I think it's important that you realize that you're more a platform, and that when you put that word out there, there'll be a lot of people who might want to work with you.
Absolutely. Akshita, we are coming to the end.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, after this fantastic presentation, I think everybody knows why I was so keen to get you and to participate. And it also is clear to me that this lecture series is so important, because we don't hear these stories. They're here and there, hidden in the newspaper article and so on, but how do we find out about this? I mean, I am seriously amazed, at what you have done, such a young person, but how you connect to the history. And we talked a little bit earlier, and it was really interesting that, to listen at each and every personal story to heritage. Each one is worth mentioning. And usually it is not a straight road, right? And you kind of discovered India and everything you are doing also by going abroad. And I cannot underestimate the positive aspect of cultural encounters, because the world wants to tell us that there are, only these kind of ideas of domination. And I really don't think so. For thousands of years, people were interested in trade, in novelty, in travel, in exploration, also with the good side and the bad side, but with both. And here, what you are doing, you are accentuating everything. And I am amazed what you have achieved in such a short time. And you are really a social entrepreneur, because you have something beyond your own self. You have some vision that is greater than yourself. And I think we really need people like this. We need to collaborate. And this is really, really wonderful. I'd like to ask a few more questions in between, because I'm sure everyone really wanted to, ask some questions. One question that I would like to ask, and at this point, is you mentioned so many programs. I mean, you have a shop. The initiatives are massive. How did you actually learn about this? You mentioned one case, you had an intern who taught you about this, but even, any small thing about organic farming and so on, it takes a lifetime to study and perfect all of these things. How did you come from the vision that you have to the finished kind of product? How did you do that?
Yes. So in terms, do you mean that in terms of all our arts and crafts and what was available in the district, how do we find out about those and then string them together?
How did you implement it? I mean, you said, okay, I want to go and restore the house. Okay, you found, let's say, an architect, but even finding the right one, because you can work with the wrong person, it doesn't work out. Or so you want to do composting. How do you actually know how to do it? And so on every little step that you did, every brand, learning about sustainability. How did you get this knowledge and then implement it? Or did you kind of collaborate with the right people at all times? How did you actually do this?
That's a fantastic question. And I think for me, it was, I said this to you, Mimi, and I'm going to make a joke about it, but it's not easy to get all the royal families under one roof to learn from each other. Especially when you're like, it's collaboration and not, but for me, it's collaboration and not competition. Like all of us are white elephants, and every day we're bleeding, and you can't put a band-aid on it. You have to figure out, like, with each other, best practices. Some families have been doing it for a longer time. For me, the beginning, first of all, I would like to say that I'm the smallest part of this. I'm like just because I'm open to public speaking and experiences and partnerships, but my family had a huge role to play with this. My father was in active politics for 15 years. He was minister of sports and a few other portfolios. My mother has had a career in development, and she started her own school for street children in Calcutta. My sister is a student of sociology, and she was interested in getting into investment banking before she switched and became a full-time yoga teacher. So we came from very different disciplines, and I was myself a student of politics and history. But the very interesting fact was I started reading on my grandparents, because the British, one thing they did was document everything beautifully. So they started documenting what the state was doing. And I was like, oh, my great grandfather had a school for this, for archaeology. My other grandmother had a school for architecture. And this person was promoting this art school. And someone else was doing something for, or for Ayurveda. They were opening up an Ayurveda school. So all the roots that we're talking about now was nothing new. It was actually came from, generations of my family, each of them having a different interest. And me being like, oh, wow, like they actually thought of all of this together. Because why would you have a ministry of development? Why would you have a ministry for farming where you were looking at indigenous practices? And I was like, okay, they saw these things. They had a ministry. It wasn't called tourism. It was called foreign affairs or international affairs, where they would keep, but they were traveling to all these hotels and places. So I think they had the building blocks there. But apart from that, I think having a foreign education and going to an international school in Singapore and living in a boarding school with people from all over the world and different cultures, and then traveling to New York, where I was really immersed in this in the field of understanding international affairs. It was a little bit of all of that. And then to put it all together, like how did we understand this, was because the idea was never to build a hotel. That's where it came from. The idea was to build an institution that was able to support local communities. What do local communities need? They need livelihood. They need clean water. They need electricity. So then you go back from there. Then you build the hotel structure in a way that supports local communities. So then you're going to take out a little bit of the land and saying this land will be for solar. This will be for water reharvesting. Because if you start with the idea of let's build a fantastic hotel, you're gonna look like, I'm going to not name names, but you're going to look like a big hotel chain. You're not going to look like a property. So when people come into Bulgaria, they need to feel that we have an understanding of this. So for example, then the decoration was easy, because then we're going to have local handicrafts. We're going to get an architect. Our architect was a woman, of course, but it was also someone who we looked at her portfolio and said, okay, you've done old buildings before. But to be really honest, what we needed was archaeologists, and we didn't have that. When I tried to go to the museum, or we didn't get any state funds, it's still going to take time for people to think and help erstwhile royal families without that ego there. But what we really needed was archaeologists. We needed serious restorationists. We needed serious, we were getting interns, but we didn't say no to them, because you can learn from everybody.
I mean, it's a model, and it's really wonderful. You have a different set of skills and talents which come together. But I think you mentioned the one key thing, that's collaboration. And you can listen, you see, where the problems, you actually look for it. You watch out, and then you respond. This shows a big heart. This shows, a great mind as well. This is exactly what we need. And if you take Palace Day, for instance, we didn't spend 1 rupee on this, but look what we've achieved, right? And this is what I like. When we work together, we see what the needs are, we collaborate, we have a vision, we have a good, goal, which is to preserve these buildings, to build communities as well around the buildings. Everything comes together. Akshita, there's someone who would like to ask a question. Ankit, let me see whether I can unmute, or maybe someone from IT can help me to unmute Ankit's phone. Otherwise, you can ask a question in the chat. Let me see, how do I do this? So I am Ankit.
Yeah. Well, I'm also, in fact, not a full-time member of the team and the center, but I do participate. But my question to you is not about, well, history is important, but my question to you is from a different lens of history, culture, and the luxury Indian traveler. Like you, I've also studied international relations. I've traveled to different countries. I've had the pleasure of staying at the metropole in Moscow. I've had the pleasure of staying in the Four Seasons in Istanbul, or if it's a villa in Izmir, or whether if it's the Royal Overseas in London.
Yeah.
And to my mind, these places are like oases. They are places full of tranquility, and they reflect what that particular place is about. And after seeing your presentation, I realized that you emulate that. Whilst you do it in a different form and a different format altogether, you are like what I have seen in different countries. What, and I am also a firm believer that empowered women should empower women. That again is something that you are a foundation of. But I mean, you repeatedly mentioned, and I think, and this is what I want to ask: why are the government babus not helping you? Why is it that the government fails to recognize how important tourism as an industry is in India, and why hospitality fails? So,
Yeah.
I mean, my mind goes back to when the Commonwealth countries first met in India, and the Taj Group created Goa. That is excellence. That is excellence of using culture and heritage to advantage. Last summer, I was in Greece for Turkey, and the whole Greek economy stands on tourism and art and architecture. So, what according to you is the why does the Indian government remain in a silo? Why don't they understand how important tourism can be from an economic perspective and others?
Correct. So I'm going to answer that by saying that the government is made up of people, and it's people like you and me who vote. And I would like to ask how many people you have voted. So if you care about historic properties, it's on the citizens. And I can't tell, I can't blame the government because they are not seeing it as a priority. And you need to understand that first of all, urban cities don't vote. Then the people who do vote in villages, pehle unko pani to do. They need clean water and clean electricity, and they need roofs over their heads, and they need to make sure they have jobs. Then you can't be like, oh, by the way, I may not be able to build a well because I'm promoting a historic ruin. But what I'm trying to explain is what you're saying is right in the sense that it's just two sides of the same coin. Progress doesn't mean that we leave out historic properties because they need to, because for example, if the government sees value in historic properties, the government will help you. If you're giving historic properties again to be, you've traveled to some beautiful places, and most of the time when my family traveled, we should travel to these decrepit, I remember being so frustrated because as a child growing up, all my friends went to Europe, and I know where Izmir is, but they went to Greece, and they went to, very fantastic places. They stayed at the Radisson or the Taj, the ITC. And my family we would go to some we'd go to some offbeat place and never heard of it, never heard of these places. And you'd see these like palaces with like trophies in every corner, and they would be dark, and there were lanterns, and you're like, and it was just a different idea. But then I realized, obviously much later, that these were a lot of properties within family, friends, and all of them didn't look like 5 stars. So my whole life, I've never traveled actually and lived in 5 stars. For me, it was always offbeat travel. It was always boutique properties, homestays, and there was always someone in the family who had like an old property that we went to. So there was an appreciation for how hard it was for these families to look luxurious because the industry backing you. And the point of the government, the Orissa tourism government, has actually been really helpful to us. But it was when we generated that marketing. And there were a lot of people in my family who were like, why do you talk to media? Why do you tell media how many cars you have or you don't have? Why do you show before or after pictures? Why do we have to tom about our lifestyle? But to be really honest, my ancestors were royalty, and I'm a descendant of theirs, but I'm no more as royalty as you are. I don't know what that means. I'm just a poet. That's one facet of me, but there are a lot of other facets of my interest. So I work with the government. I'm happy to wait in line for the babus with my proposal in hand. And I do that very happily because you have to also explain to people why should they spend money on this. you know, we have a pond of like 10 acres behind our property, and it was used for boating. It used migratory birds would come. Now, if I go to the government and I say, look, we have a pond, and please, it looks really ugly that they've, you know, it's grown, weeds have grown there. They'll say, okay, great, get in line. That person has like, you know, 10 other problems. And so then I realized that we were like, okay, for rejuvenation of that pond, we're going to use local NGOs where we can make them work and give them employment. And we can also use that boat to actually do it's called aquatic farming, where you can do farming on ponds. So we're trying to get in touch with NGOs who can help us. So, you know, my question for a lot of young Indians, including me, where we say, why isn't the government doing this, is because you have to show the government there's value. You know, we should not run historic properties like philanthropies. We should run them like corporates and startups. Start putting GDP and figures and data analytics and insights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We cannot sit idle, and we can also use so many things that don't cost us anything. We don't need to pay for expensive ads. We can use social media, and so we can do all of this ourselves. Everything is there to learn. You can use, you know, YouTube. You can, you know, for learning how to use social media and so on. There is no excuse really, you know, to sit idle. I agree.
And I just mean we cannot wait for the government any longer. We cannot wait to be bailed out. You know, we have to sort of show, you know, invest in the Make in India initiative. We have to see what are government priorities and, you know, lobby them on those priorities. So Make in India, Startup Initiative, India Inc., get startups behind you. You know, use platforms like your story and be like, how are we going to be an entrepreneurial initiative? Then if you're talking about creation of jobs, if you're talking about supporting self-help groups in the cottage industry, you're talking about you know, being able to actually it's always create jobs and you know, give back to the GDP. Then you're going to have their eyeballs, and once you have the eyeballs, and then you make sure you have a proposal that works.
Yes, you are a fantastic businesswoman, entrepreneurial visionary, no doubt, and someone who loves the country in the tradition and the culture, and who wants to do good. And I think, you know, people will recognize this, and people in the government or private people, whoever it is, you will be seen, you will be heard. There's no doubt about this. With these words, I'd like to come to the end. I'd like to thank you so much. We'll stay in touch. We want to collaborate. We want to work together. Nice. And you know, I think that this is for everyone in India to see, you know, to learn from this example. It's really wonderful. It's innovative. It's fantastic. And, you know, it should be seen. And, you know, we'd love to support you on your journey. So anybody else who would like to get in touch with us, or Akshita, we've shared the details, you know, of the palace, and they have a wonderful webpage. And otherwise, please get in touch with the center. We are happy to connect you, put you in touch. And we love to hear from volunteers, anybody who would like to get involved to ensure that heritage will continue to thrive. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.